Delicious in Dungeon was a very hyped up show going into its release in winter of 2024, but I think it kind of became even more hyped the longer it went on. This show just became very charming, very appealing to a lot of people, watching these four goofballs who, seem to just kind of tolerate each other, but deep down, they like each other, go through this really inventive and creative dungeon, finding all of these unique monsters, cooking them with a bunch of really delicious looking food, even though it's made out of monsters, and just generally being a really fun time, only to then throw in some very interesting uses of tone. It just ended up being a very delightful experience, one that had a little bit of something for everyone to enjoy. And as someone who watched the show weekly, it was such a treat to have every Thursday, and one that I think ended up getting a lot of reach, ironically, because it was on Netflix. Now, normally we're used to thinking that if a show ends up on Netflix for streaming, it's going to reduce its popularity and reduce its reach, because what does Netflix usually do? They throw it into Netflix jail. The show does not actually get put on Netflix until it's done airing in Japan, for example. This is one of those shows where we got a weekly release for it, and it was released dubbed and subbed. It was not all in one batch, so anybody who doesn't like the binge model that Netflix typically does got to watch something week by week and engage in discussion and speculation. And I think that because Netflix handled it in that way, you didn't have that restriction of its reach. If anything, it enhanced its reach, because a lot more people are going to have Netflix than have something like Crunchyroll. If it's on Netflix and people can watch it weekly and they don't have to wait for it, it's going to end up becoming a success, I feel. A lot really went into making Delicious in Dungeon as big of a show as it ended up being. And I really do want to emphasize the way it handles its tone, because during the first half, it does sort of feel like it's just going to be this episodic sort of slice of lifey show where, they're going through the dungeon, and yes, they have a goal, but you probably don't expect them to reach that goal until the end of the series, and you don't really expect it to play into the plot that much. Like, you're not really expecting there to be that much of a plot at all. You think it's just going to be every week they find some monsters, they hunt them, they cook them, they have some nice looking food, bicker with each other, and they do bicker a lot, but that's part of why this group of characters is so enjoyable. They're all a little weird, they're all a little off kilter kind of, but they're so fun to watch, especially as an ensemble cast. And that honestly would have been enough to make this show worth watching. If it just was purely, literally monster of the week, except you're cooking the monster at the end of the episode, that would have been fine if that was all it was for 24 episodes. But then we get to the halfway point and we find out that that plot point that seemingly was driving the whole story wasn't as far away as we may have thought. And we get this shift in tone where the show gets serious and genuinely kind of dark and unnerving, but never really loses the fun, adventurous aspect that it had before. And even as the show continues on for the rest of its second half, it ends up still having those darker moments, especially as it's exploring more about this world, more about how the dungeon works, more about certain characters' backstories and trauma they experienced in the past, while still maintaining that, yes, every week we're going to find new monsters and we're going to cook more monsters and we're going to have weird stuff happen and it's going to be comedic, right? It never loses that, even as it starts to explore darker story elements. And that is not an easy thing to achieve. It's very common for a show that tries to juggle multiple different tones to end up coming off as jarring as it tries to go back and forth between the two. Just as an example, one that always comes to mind to me is the first season of Full Metal Panic, where that show tries to be serious but also tries to have this over-the-top comedy, and it really never worked in the first season. But the reason why the other seasons were so good is because they kind of decided, okay, we're going to have the comedy in this season, we're going to have the serious story in the other season, and by breaking them apart from each other, they were both able to succeed. But trying to mix them into one season really didn't work. And there are other shows that try to do the same thing and it just comes off as not feeling right, like the show doesn't know what it wants to be. You never really know if an episode is going to feel right. With Delicious in Dungeon, that is not a problem. It's able to shift into these darker topics without losing what made it so appealing in the beginning. It never feels like the show is trying to pull a twist and shift into a completely different genre. It's still the same show. And the fact that it can make those transitions so seamlessly really is a testament to the strength of the writing behind this series. And it's a show that I'm very much so looking forward to. It's already announced season 2, coming whenever that may be. What I want to talk about now, though, is not just more praise for this show. you probably already know that this show is worth watching. It became very popular for all the reasons I already mentioned. What I want to discuss is if this show is going to contribute to a shift in the anime landscape. Now, some of you may hear that and think, well, that's kind of presumptive. Why would it do that? It's a good show, but is it really going to change anything with the type of anime coming out? I think we may already see the evidence that it has. So let's go back in time to 2012. Everyone knows what show came out in 2012 that sparked a massive shift in the type of anime we would see coming out season after season after season. In July of 2012, we got Sword Art Online, which completely single-handedly sparked the isekai boom. Now, isekai, of course, already existed prior to SAO. You can go back to shows in the 90s like Escaflowne to see them. And even being trapped in a video game precedes SAO. Look at Dot Hack, for example. But SAO became so big and so popular and so profitable that it spawned a bunch of clones. Shows that initially focused on being trapped in a video game like SAO, or being trapped in a fantasy world that is directly based on a video game. Look at things like Log Horizon or Overlord. And little by little, it shifted towards, well, maybe we're not in a video game. Maybe we're in a fantasy world that's just heavily inspired and influenced by video game elements. And then little by little, those kind of went away, and it just turned into what we sort of expect from isekai now. You know, you get hit by a truck, you end up there. Maybe you want to get back, maybe you don't, but it's basically just some sort of fantasy world where you've often been reincarnated into. That's sort of the blueprint we've seen followed again and again and again. But it transitioned out of what SAO had initially started. Recently, I feel like we're starting to see another transition occur, because a number of isekai have come out over the past couple years that have kind of suppressed the actual isekai element and have mostly just been fantasy worlds that technically are isekai because a character either has memories from another world or came from another world, but it really isn't focused on all that much. I think of something like Magical Revolution from last year, which, yes, is an isekai, but you could cut out the minor mention of the character having memories from another life, and the show would not change whatsoever. And I feel like we're seeing more of that now. Shows where, yes, they're technically isekai, and you can still label them as isekai, which maybe is the entire point because you can market them that way, but they're not really isekai. They're fantasy shows that are just doing the bare minimum to qualify as an isekai. So what started off as characters being trapped in a video game that happens to be a fantasy world has slowly transitioned to characters basically in a fantasy world that is only loosely connected to our world through one or more characters kind of having memories of a past life. And at that same time, we've started to see fantasy shows, just straight fantasy shows, like Delicious in Dungeon, also Frieren, of course, start to come out and take the anime world by storm. We also have Witch Hat coming out next year, which is also a very highly anticipated fantasy series. So it makes me wonder, are we seeing a shift from these isekai stories that are basically fantasy stories that are only kind of isekai in name only to just straight up fantasy that don't even pretend to be isekai? And is Delicious in Dungeon, because of how popular it got, contributing to that transition? Are we going to look at the anime landscape in a couple years and see more straight fantasy than we see isekai? I'm starting to wonder. This is really the first time in the 12 years since the isekai boom started that I'm starting to wonder if we are moving out of it and moving on to sort of the next big thing, even though, you know, it's not like an abrupt change. It's still something evolving out of isekai. The other thing that makes me wonder if that's happening, and it specifically ties into Delicious in Dungeon, is the fact that right now during this season, there are multiple, and I mean multiple, dungeon anime airing. Now, granted, they're not really all that well talked about, they're not super popular, but there are multiple shows that in some way involve a dungeon, some that even involve dungeons in like a meta sense. If we're getting shows like that already, when Delicious in Dungeon just ended, are we going to see a dungeon boom? Are we going to see not just more fantasy anime, but specifically fantasy anime set in dungeons? Now, of course, anime that involve dungeons, fantasy, isekai, or otherwise, are not new. Those have already existed, but never really in the same way as Delicious in Dungeon, where it is like, specifically, you are exploring this dungeon. You're exploring, how did this dungeon get built? How do all the monsters live in this dungeon? What role do they play? Like, exploring a lot of the internal structure and logic behind the dungeon, having the show primarily set in the dungeon and not only sometimes set in there, only involving it sometimes. That's a little bit different. And maybe because of Delicious in Dungeon, because of how big it got, we're going to see more people try to cash in on that. Like they tried to cash in on, of course, SAO all the way back in 2012. Now, I'm not saying Delicious in Dungeon's popularity is anywhere near on the level of SAO's. It's not. But the combination of it, Frieren, and a number of other big fantasy anime coming out, And specifically Delicious in Dungeon kind of having its own niche in there because of the dungeon's prominence in the story. Maybe we will see a transition specifically to dungeon shows alongside other pure fantasy. I just feel like it's been a very quick turnover from Delicious in Dungeon coming out, finishing, and now we have all these other dungeon anime already. I don't know, we may start to see more and more of them as they try to mimic the success of Delicious in Dungeon and other fantasy shows. And I think that would be really interesting because it wouldn't be like a sharp break from what came before with isekai. It would just be continuing to evolve out of that initial spark that SAO set. It would still have a lot of the same feel as most other isekais, but they wouldn't be isekais. They would be fantasy again. The landscape of anime could be in a very interesting moment where we are on the precipice of a notable transition. Just like how prior to the isekai boom, moe slice of life was everywhere and people complained about it and were like, oh, why do we keep getting all these shows? And now we're at a point where over 12 years we had people complaining about isekai. Why do we keep getting isekai? Especially when most of them are not very good. Why do we keep getting them? Well, maybe we'll start to get more and more fantasy shows and dungeon shows instead of isekai. That isn't to say isekai will go away, because of course it won't. Isekai existed prior to SAO, and because of how big it is, it's never going away, just like moe slice of life has not gone away, even as isekai supplanted it as the big thing for anime to do. Isekai is not going anywhere, and I don't think you should expect in the next couple seasons to see a massive drop-off in the amount of isekai. No, you're still going to see a ridiculous amount of isekai coming out every season. But little by little, we might start to see less isekai and more fantasy, and potentially specifically more dungeon fantasy. It really could be interesting to watch, and if that transition does happen, we have shows like Frieren and, most importantly, like Delicious in Dungeon to thank for it. So let me know what you thought of Delicious in Dungeon in the comments down below, and if you think it will be sparking this transition in the type of anime we should be expecting to see come out over the next few years. I'm very curious to see what others think about this. Thank you so much for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and until next time, take care everyone. Look forward to the next video.